is that the Chinese have released a new batch of demographic data, and it is, in a word, atrocious. Two big pieces of information. First of all, birth rates. In order to maintain your current population, a country needs a birth rate of roughly 2.1 children per woman. With the new data, China is now at 1.16, which is the lowest in their history and the second lowest in human history ever. That's on top of the fact that their biggest cities now have birth rates that are below 0.7, making it impossible for them to maintain their population at all unless they raid the countryside, and China has been raiding the countryside for the last 40 years, and there are now not a lot of people left to pull in. That means, just from this one statistic, China is already the fastest aging society in human history. The second big number is that China's population peaked last year, in fact, with the population dropping by about 800,000 people. The scary thing about both of these figures is that we know they're wrong. A couple years ago, the Chinese started releasing bits and pieces out of their 2020 decade census, and they came to the grudging and public admission that they had overcounted their population by in excess of 100 million people, with all of those missing millions having been born since the one-child policy was adopted 40 years ago. So we're talking about exclusively these 100 million people or so are people who would have been aged 40 or under, the folks who have the kids. You combine that with the birth rate information, and we are looking at the complete dissolution of the Chinese demography in a very short period of time. Because if you're losing a lot of people, or you've never had a lot of people under age 40, that suggests that the ability of the Chinese system to maintain a workforce and a tax base is dissolving before our eyes. And we've never seen a system any time in history that's been able to make it through this sort of transition without a massive, massive, massive change in the political and economic environment. And the possible changes the Chinese are about to experience are not what I would consider things that will make this work better. The problem is that the Chinese model, economic model, is completely dependent upon globalization and internationalization. This is a country that imports 75 to 80% of their oil. This is the world's largest importer of food. This is a country whose oil comes primarily from the Persian Gulf, which is no longer being patrolled by anyone with a navy. And this is a country whose economic model is utterly dependent upon the ability to import raw materials and tech and then export semi-finished and finished goods to other markets that are in a different hemisphere for the most part. None of this works unless everyone gets along. And China has seen its economic and political relations with every single trading partner bottom out, with the exception, of course, with the Russians, because there's a shared love of genocide there. So a couple things. First, to a degree, we've always known that this was coming. In addition to the one-child policy, the Chinese have been the fastest urbanizing country in human history. And when you move off the farm and into the city, kids become a bit of a luxury good as opposed to free labor, so everyone has fewer of them. And the fact that urbanization happened at the same time as the one-child policy just crunched down the birth rate even more. We've now seen the birth rate officially, by the numbers that are probably over-optimistic, fall by more than 60% in just the last 6 years. And this is to a degree expected, because when the birth rate is low for long enough, eventually, 30, 40 years on, it cuts into the number of people who are having the children in the first place. So if you have a smaller generation with a much lower birth rate, you get a catastrophically lower birth rate, and that's exactly where we are right now, and this will not get better unless we figure out human cloning at scale. Second is the issue of timing. At the rate of degradation, there will have never been a country we already have never had a country in human history in this sort of situation, but we don't even have an economic theory for how an economy might function if this Chinese data continues on its current path for just another 8 years. So 2030 is probably the use-by date if it doesn't break sooner. And that assumes nothing else goes wrong in the Chinese system. Nothing with agriculture, nothing with trade, nothing with finance, nothing with the Americans, nothing with energy. I just wanted to take the opportunity today to do a quick update on what's going on with COVID and China. I think the biggest thing to underline is we really don't know what's going on. China has always been an information control space, but they have always been pretty good at collecting data, just not necessarily reporting it. Yes, there have been problems with their data collection, but what they share with the world just doesn't match what they see internally. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of folks like me just don't trust the data at all. But what they've done with this opening due to COVID is they've changed the policy completely. Instead of collecting data and lying about it, they're just not collecting it. So, supposedly only a few dozen people have died in total from COVID in the last couple of years. And they were reporting officially back in December that they had a few thousand new cases, but we know now that the new case tally is in excess of a couple of million a day. Some independent estimates say it's in over 20 or 30 million. We also don't know much about the virus, and this is where things get a little scary. COVID, it changes relatively rapidly. We've been seeing new variants every few months. But in China, now that we have over 1 billion people who have been exposed all at once, it's a different sort of scenario. You can certainly argue that very few countries in the world got it right when it comes to managing COVID. I mean, we've all kind of been making this up as we go along because the goalposts keep moving. And whether you believe in natural immunity or vaccinated immunity, most people who are willing to, not be morons about it will admit that people on the other side have a point that is worth considering. This hasn't been in play in China. The Chinese vaccines have been proven over and over and over again by almost every country that has tried to use them to be broadly ineffective at preventing COVID. And so most countries that originally started using the Chinese formulas have switched to other formulas that come from different countries. India does their own. Obviously, the Western countries have their own. The Russians have their own. And some of these are better than others, but the Chinese are definitely at the bottom of the barrel. And so they've pretty much vanished from global use. The Chinese also aren't going to have an mRNA formula for at least a couple of years, or at least not one that's probably ready for prime time. So that's an issue for another day rather than the outbreaks that we're seeing in China right now. Which means what's going on in China is something that's very difficult to predict. There are two factors when it comes to COVID, or really any pathogen. First of all, you need to know it's R0 or it's R0, and that's the number of people on average that each infected person will then contaminate. And then the second thing, of course, is lethality. What's your chance of actually dying from this thing? Now, it takes time to figure that out because you first have to wait for the virus to mutate, and then you have to wait for it to get into a general population, and then you have to collect the data, and then you have to wait to see if people are going to die, and you collect that data too. So on average, from the point that a new variant emerges to the point that we have a decent grip on how communicable and how lethal it is, it's usually around 6 months. And that's one of the reasons why policy across the world has been so schizophrenic, because policymakers are attempting to figure out what to do for health policy before they have the data. And if you wait until after you have the data, you may have lost a few 100,000 people already, and we've seen that time and time again around the world. Now, the Chinese are struggling with this at the moment, just like everybody else, just on a much grander scale, because so few people in the country have any sort of real resistance. Until recently, no one's had COVID, and then of course the vaccines are not all that great. But for the rest of us, China choosing to not share data, but China choosing to not even collect data means that we can have literally millions of deaths in China and the rest of the world doesn't know what to get ready for. We can't even begin the process of understanding what the new variants that are circulating in China are going to mean for the rest of us. So we know there are at least 7 different variants. We knew that back in December. We also knew that at least 2 of those variants didn't exist 2 to 3 months previous. So the only data that has existed was back in December before this all blew up when the Chinese were still lying about everything. Now they're not even collecting the data, so we are not going to have a good idea of what we're going to be struggling with until 6 months after this virus breaks out of the Chinese population and into the global commons. So, could be nothing. Maybe this is the most mild variant yet. Could be horrible. This could be the most lethal variant yet. We just don't know, and we won't know for months. Blah.
China, the world's most populous country, is rapidly becoming a global superpower. With a population of over 1.4 billion people and a booming economy, China is influencing the world in unprecedented ways. One of the most visible ways China is affecting the world is through its massive infrastructure projects. The Belt and Road Initiative, also known as the New Silk Road, is a vast network of infrastructure projects that stretches from Asia to Europe and Africa. China is investing billions of dollars in these projects, which include ports, highways, railways, and pipelines. By doing so, China is reshaping the global economy and creating new trade routes that will connect it to the rest of the world. China is also the world's factory. Its cheap labor and efficient manufacturing processes have made it the go-to destination for companies looking to cut costs. As a result, China has become the world's largest exporter of goods. This has led to a significant shift in the global supply chain, with many countries relying on China for essential goods like electronics, clothing, and household items. China is investing heavily in science and technology, with a particular focus on artificial intelligence, 5G, and quantum computing. Chinese companies like Huawei, Alibaba, and Tencent are leading the way in these fields, and their innovations are likely to shape the future of technology. However, China's rise has not been without controversy. Its human rights record has been heavily criticized, particularly in relation to its treatment of ethnic minorities such as the Uyghurs and Tibetans. China's crackdown on dissent in Hong Kong has also raised concerns about its commitment to democracy and freedom of speech. As China's influence continues to grow, the world is watching closely. Will China become a force for good or a threat to global stability? Only time will tell. Whatever the future holds, one thing is certain: China will continue to affect the world in significant ways.